Hello and welcome to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. I'm going to go through a paper, and essentially this is probably best termed as a suggestion paper. It's not really a research paper as such, it's not a review as such, and it's not really a letter to the editor. It's a suggestion as to how some may use an interdisciplinary approach with respect to functional MRI and brain imaging. And this is from 2014. Now, I came across this because I was listening to an interview with one of the authors, Dr. Saad, and it had some interesting topics in it. And one of the topics was the illusion of explanatory depth. And we'll get into that. And I will say that the illusion of explanatory depth, because I've decided to go and track it down a little bit more, falls neatly into what would be termed a description of a cognitive bias. A cognitive bias, as I would put it, is a mistaken thinking that the person doesn't know they're making. So they are unlikely to be able to fix it or identify it. Somebody would have to identify it for them. And then generally with the illusion of explanatory depth, one of the ways in which it's suggested to identify that somebody doesn't know what they think they know, or as much as what they think they know, is to ask them to explain something, and then they recognize that they don't know it. So that is, say, as a teaching mechanism, you just ask somebody to explain something to the best of their knowledge, and you see what they know and what they don't know. You can use that punitively, or you can use that in a formative fashion to say, oh, you know what, you did good here, here, and here, but because you were missing this piece of information, you didn't get it quite right, so here's the new piece of information that would help you update your understanding. Anyways, I'm going to read and talk, as I often do, from this paper. The paper is Using Evolutionary Theory to Enhance the Brain Imaging Paradigm. This is from 2014. So again, I will read. In recent years, there seems to be no preference, choice, emotion, thought, or behavior that has escaped the scrutiny of a neuroimaging machine. Scanning the brain allegedly reveals insights into the foundations of morality. Green et al., 2001, altruism. Tankersley et al., 2007, sense of humor. Bartolo et al., 2006, and even religious beliefs in God. Capogianis et al., 2009, to name a few of the disparate topics that have been studied. As neuroimaging studies become increasingly popular, a growing number of researchers in the business discipline are applying such techniques within their areas of interest. In such works, researchers look at and map the parts of the brain that are involved in processing decisions, preferences, and choices. Studies range from predicting future sales of popular songs based on how certain areas in the brain were activated on a sample of individuals prior to a song's release, Burns and Moore, 2012, how advertisements using various forms of persuasion engage different parts of the brain, Cook et al., 2011, and how arbitrary prices of wine alter the reward activities in an area of the brain associated with pleasure, Plasman et al., 2008. All right, so essentially this is setting it up as the opening to say, yeah, people are basically using an MRI on a bunch of different, an fMRI on the brain when they ask for a bunch of different tasks and seeing where it goes. Because, you know, if I know where the blood flow goes in the brain, then I know where, you know, then I can start to target how to get that area of the brain to light up by doing a bunch of other research and, say, beta testing. So test between two things, which one lit it up more, this area of the brain, then test between two things, two other things. So the first thing that lit the area up more, and then a new thing, and then so on and so on, right? You test between two things to figure out how you can really get that area of the brain to light up. And then the assumption would be, if I can get that area of the brain to light up, then I can sell products, or then I can read people's mind from a blood flow proxy. Okay, so I'll read again. The modus operandi of most imaging procedures, such as fMRI, is to track blood oxygenation in the brain, with the underlying assumption that as blood flows through a region, the more neurons are activated in this area. The idea behind such studies is not only to locate the exact area in the brain where information is processed, but also to have insights into people's true thoughts and preferences, since individuals cannot control their brain activity and are not always consciously aware of their thought processes. There's a prevailing view that by looking at individuals' brain activation patterns, we could unveil their latent desires. Airely and Burns, 2010, discussed this premise skeptically, specifically in the marketing discipline, where there's a nagging fear that by looking at people's brains, marketers would be able to predict individuals' penchants for certain products, future acquisitions, and needs, and hence manipulate customers to take advantage of those desires. So again, this starts off by saying these authors think about this skeptically, and I would very much agree with the skepticism. Just because there are neurons activating in a particular location doesn't mean that you can appropriately predict a thought. Now, I've talked about this previously with fMRI and predicting or being able to reverse engineer an image that somebody was seeing. So it didn't go the way that people would think it goes or it went. It didn't read the mind. It was trained on data of blood flow patterns of people looking at known images. Then what ended up happening is they took the knowability or the ability for the computer to know what image was there, and then they showed the image, and then based on the blood flow patterns, they reverse engineered the image. That's not really the case. Like, if it had been able to do it without knowing what the heck the image was, we'd be talking. But it had to know what the image was, read the areas, and then reverse engineer it. So it's not quite what people are saying it is. Anyways, to read again. The fear is probably unwarranted and stems from what Rosenbit and Keel 2002 describe as the illusion of explanatory depth, namely to exhibit overconfidence in one's ability to offer veridical explanations about natural phenomena when one's true knowledge is tentative at best. Neuroimaging scholars are especially susceptible to such biases. Striking, colorful brain photos and associated technical jargon have a persuasive effect on researchers and lay person alike. McCabe and Castell, 2008, Trout, 2008, Weisberg et al., 2008. But this should not blind us to some of the shortcomings of the paradigm, including the likelihood of reporting spurious correlations, Vol et al., 2009, and false positives such as the infamous case of the neuronal activation patterns found in a dead Atlantic salmon, Bennett et al., 2010. Next, we detail some of the problems in neuroimaging research that need to be taken into account and offer a theoretical framework that might be helpful in better interpreting the reaped results. Right, so that paragraph basically says, if you show people fancy images, so essentially what ended up happening in those experiments was you'd have more or less the same write-up, I think exactly the same write-up, and then you'd have the same write-up with no pictures as the same write-up with sexy pictures, and people thought that the sexy pictures made it more explanatory, right? So if you present something in a nice package, people may be more likely to approach it or consume it. And then what ends up happening is, let's just say it's the exact same. So it's like, if you're in Canada, you get the no-name stuff. Now, this isn't perfect because there is variable quality in the no-name stuff based on how they actually purchase and sell things. But you could have the same thing made in the same place and sold under two different brands. And because the packaging is sexier on one brand and less sexy on the other brand, the less sexy package costs less. You can look at auto parts, and sometimes original parts for a particular manufacturer really are a part that they bought from a supplier with a very specific number on it and the supplier's name on it. But when they sell it through their network, it's original auto manufacturer part. But then if you know what you're looking at, you can go and find the exact same part for way less money. Not all the time, but often. And then, do I need to read more of that? This is a paragraph that I'd like to read. It's not the immediate paragraph following what I've already read. It's one paragraph after that, and I want to read this, so I'm going to. A more fundamental problem in neuroimaging studies is the inability to identify the exact area in the brain responsible for a given cognitive process. The brain, which consumes roughly 20% of all energy in our body, is responsible for monitoring and managing every human activity and is built in a complex network where different modules work simultaneously for almost any task. See Pinker, 1997. At any moment, multiple areas are activated concurrently, and it is not easy to pinpoint the one region that is responsible for a certain thought or desire, if one such place even exists. Neuroimaging studies are adept at illuminating areas in the brain that are associated with certain behaviors, thoughts, or preferences, but interpreting which functions these areas serve based on the images is difficult and typically cannot be derived directly from such images. Moreover, highlighted areas in the brain do not exclude the possibility that other parts of it are also involved, as these parts may already be activated but not show additional activity with the new task. Lee et al. 2012. That said, recent studies have documented the ability to classify mental states, namely to accurately map a mental tasks with a particular activation pattern. Poldrack et al. 2009. To continue to read, Locating a neuronal activation pattern in the brain tells us little about the underlying causes that led to the cortical activity in question. To better understand the causal mechanisms that lead individuals to act the way they do, we need a meta-theory, one that has the power to explain the ultimate causes of behaviors and preferences and not just help locate them in the brain. Evolution is the only scientific theory that could explain the underlying ultimate causes of behaviors and preferences and the forces that shape them via natural and sexual selection processes. So I'm going to stop there. Dr. Saad and the other author, Gil Greengross. I don't know anything about Gil Greengross, so I can't comment, but Dr. Gad Saad is an evolutionary psychologist. Obviously, he's going to point to the strong benefits of evolutionary theory. That doesn't necessarily serve my purpose. Evolutionary theory has many strong points, and I'm sure there would be some fallbacks. Knowing what I know about Dr. Saad, it's highly likely that Dr. Saad would do a great job of identifying where there were shortcomings in a given approach with the details that were required. So I think it would be very powerful. But the thing that allows me to do when we talk about the paradigm of brain imaging, and we talk about knowing the location as an explanation, when we also know that there are multiple factors involved in many processes. So let's just say we talk about the pulsation of cerebrospinous fluid. We don't have a fully tested understanding of what produces the pulsation in cerebrospinous fluid. The old explanation that is utilized in osteopathic realms or osteopathic discussions or osteopathy in the cranial field, whatever you want to talk about, craniosacral therapy, that is provably incorrect. The location, direction, where CSF is produced, we're understanding more and more about that over time. That's an example. Because when we talk about what we're learning now that generates that pulsation, it seems like it's thoracic respiration, a combination in some way of thoracic respiration and the pulsation of arteries within the skull, right? So in relation to the brain. The arteries that feed the brain seem to generate some of the pulsation of cerebrospinous fluid, along with thoracic respiration. And there may be other things. So it's entirely possible that something else could impact it, which we haven't quite figured it out yet. If we want to talk about digestion, there are going to be areas in the brain and nuclei in the brain that are going to work together in varying loops to impact digestion. Right? So obviously we got the vagus nerve and the nuclei associated with the vagus nerve. The paper that I was speaking about previously from Dr. Lisa Feldman-Barrett's lab about the periaqueductal gray, it seems like the ventrolateral periaqueductal gray has a general impact on the autonomic nervous system. So that's another area that we have to consider. Then the mechanical reality of thoracic respiration, heart rate, impacting digestive processes because of the movement of the abdomen, physical activity impacting digestion because of, again, the movement of the general body and mechanical stuff within the abdomen, the the smooth muscle contractions that are constant with respect to the organs of the digestive tract. All of these things are going to play a part such that the explanations that are utilized to guide people how to behave in manual therapy are probably wanting. They're probably too simple to do a great job. Now, I happen to be a person that likes simpler approaches to things so that we can have repeatable, reliable, valid behaviors in relation to what we find. So I tend to make the explanations much simpler. I take the complexity of the whole thing, the whole enterprise, and bring it down into what can you observe consistently and honestly and accurately, and what can you do in interfacing with that consistently, reliably, and accurately. And that's movement. So it either moves or it doesn't. It either squishes or it doesn't. And then anything else that happens in relation to that is essentially a positive side effect. We can also have negative things in relation to some of what we do, but we've got to build that range up. If we start from the more complex inner workings of the body that are highly multifactorial, it's very easy to get lost and not know what to do and think that you're doing it right because it's like, oh, well, I'm in the right location for this nerve, therefore I must be treating this nerve. It's like, yeah, well, what about all the other stuff? I was speaking to an athlete who had essentially had like a snap or a pop in the region of their hip when performing an athletic activity. And they were talking about getting treatment from a practitioner who said that they were specifically treating the sacrotuberous ligament. And what I simply said is that there's a lot of meat there, depending on exactly how somebody's built. Some of what you might also be interfacing with is going to be some of the glute max tissue when aiming for the sacrotuberous. And if you're aiming for the sacrotuberous, you may also run into some of the pelvic floor muscles, right? You can have the aim to hit a specific thing because it should be in that area, and you're sure it's in that area, and you're sure you're doing this thing, but you have to ignore the other multifactorial things that you're doing. So what this then does is allow the invocation as a description, the term of the illusion of explanatory depth. This crosses over very well with the term anatomical possibilism that you can find in a relatively recent 2024 range edition of the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine. Just because something's in a particular location with respect to my findings and my interpretation, that is exactly why it's happening. So it's like, yes, this particular structure is here, therefore that's exactly how and why that thing worked. So if I treat the neck and anything happens to heart rate and respiration, it has to be the vagus nerve. It couldn't possibly be the carotid body and the carotid sinus. It couldn't possibly be non-specific effects. It's got to be the vagus, right? The illusion of explanatory depth, the concept of anatomical possibilism cross over very well with respect to explanations, descriptions of the challenges with the stories in the osteopathic world and the hands-on manual therapy world in general. So that paper allows me to start to pull a bunch of ideas together and further highlight some of the angles that I'm coming from when I say, listen, if we focus on movement, we can be valid, we can be reliable, and we can get a general range of positive outcomes, and that's kind of the reliability deal. But if we start to make assumptions about the internal workings, it's highly multifactorial. You're assuming that the thing that's going wrong is only here and not all of the other places, like only wherever you think you found it and not all of the other places that it will also coexist and co-occur and be co-regulated. So you're taking something that is complex and trying to make it straightforward and essentially push button. And I totally get the aim and why you would want to do that, because it makes one have a sense of, say, competence and control over the situation when it's not really what you have. Humans are highly variable, although also highly similar at the same time, and how you interact with them will have a wide range of outcomes. You can literally do the exact same thing to a bunch of different people and have any reading go in multiple directions. Now, sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes you get all readings to go in one direction. So if we take the example of one of the students at the Osteopathic Lyceum doing their thesis project, they decided to see what impact prone oscillation would have on heart rate and blood pressure, under the general assumption, because they had learned previously that that should regulate the autonomics, like regulate the autonomic nervous system, possibly inhibit the sympathetic nervous system because you're fixating in the thoracic region, and therefore, because of the ribs, you are impacting the sympathetic chain ganglion, and generally the results go in multiple directions. So heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, heart rate goes down, blood pressure goes down, and some mix therein in all of the individuals. The cop-out explanation when you see that could be, well, because it's regulating the autonomic nervous system, because that person's heart rate was too low, it went up. Because that person's blood pressure was too high, it went down, or it came to a midpoint. And that's unfortunately not something that you can really interpret from that, because what you saw is an unreliable result pattern. You saw a lot of difference between how much heart rate changed between people and how much blood pressure changed between people. So it's just an unreliable thing. It goes everywhere, right? But the student had learned that as a part of osteopathy in general, that if you put somebody on their stomach and you wiggle them nice and smooth, that it should do something positive to their autonomic nervous system, and they found out that it is not a reliable approach with claims about the autonomic nervous system as measured through the heart, the blood, rather, I'm stumbling, as measured through the proxies of heart rate and blood pressure. So, what do you take away from that? Well, what you take away from that is that we found another location in which claims based on anatomy don't match up with observed reality. So, again, the invocation of the term anatomical possibilism, the invocation of the term illusion of explanatory depth, both cross over. There's a term consilience, when evidence from multiple fields points in the generally the same direction. Generally, humans are highly variable. Generally, they will respond in variable ways to the same stimuli. They may respond in a similar direction or in multiple directions to the same stimuli. And you would want to figure that out, which is why we're running thesis-based experiments at the Osteopathic Lyceum. So generally, this is more information that increases my level of confidence that the stories in osteopathy don't line up with observable reality. They line up with cultural explanations from the past based on the points of observation that were available and the levels of interpretation that were being done at the time. We've had more time, we have more angles, we have more information, so we can improve this. The thing that does seem to be stable across time is that we will find some individuals in which mechanical dysfunctions that are identifiable will appropriately relate to the symptom or the sensation that they present with or that they report, and that when the mechanical restriction improves in a positive direction, also that sensation improves, but not always. And then we can talk about pain theories. So nociplastic pain, we're not sure about because there's no identifiable pathology in nerve or tissue. Neuropathic pain, osteopathy probably doesn't do the best job because it's actually a pathology of the nerve. Whereas nociceptive pain, possible actual identifiable damage to tissue, osteopathy seems to perform well because we can actually interface with that tissue on some level. By restoring general range of motion, it seems to have a positive impact on the tissue signaling. So what the tissue is doing and what the nociceptor is sensing seems to then have a net positive outcome on what the patient reports as their internal state. So we can start to pull on a bunch of different things to point in the general direction that osteopathy does good work. Stories have problems for explainable reasons, and that we can also use these concepts to help us better understand the strengths and the weaknesses of the profession. So a lot of these topics you've heard me talk about before. Some of them may be new to you, but if you go back and look at this library or the library of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast, you start to see these concepts over and over and over again and how they start to sew together to help me increase my confidence that the general direction that I'm going is reasonable. It doesn't mean I'm perfectly right. I'm happy to admit that I'm probably making errors, but once again, seems to be pointing us in the right direction. Thank you for listening this far. Hope you learned something, and we'll talk again soon.